Happy New Year to you all. To everyone that has supported me over the past few years, you've all become like family to me. Past few years have been difficult for us all, and it's just a great honor to be able to communicate with you once again. As you know, I was busy with the leadership race last year, and also the last 2 years, I've been really delving into my role as the member of Parliament for Haldiman Norfolk. And many of you have written to me over the past year about this issue that I'm going to speak about today. And I wanted to get back to you earlier, and I have done some preliminary work so I could have a informed discussion with you. Your primary concern that you raised with me about was being mocked and belittled by government when you spoke about issues that pertained to the World Economic Forum and the decisions that were made and that you see that are being made that are often outside of our democratic process and that are concerning to you. So I hear you. I understand what you're going through, and you've been you've also told me time and time again that the Liberal Party just doesn't seem to be understanding what has happened to Canadians over the last 2 years with going through COVID and the increase in cost of living and the inability to pay your bills and to afford gas and food and heating, and that your concerns are largely mocked and dismissed. And many of you have had questions for government, and those questions have been ignored. In some cases, your questions were even dismissed as conspiracy theories, and that is just plain wrong. And this ties me into why I've decided to communicate with you today about this specific issue that I've submitted an order paper on. I've been submitting a number of order papers, and I'm not sure if you know, but these order papers are questions to that members of parliament submit in writing to the government, and government heads and departments are obligated to respond to them also in writing. So during last summer, I had raised concerns about the World Economic Forum during the leadership race, and I had raised concern that I believed our government had signed a number of agreements with the World Economic Forum. And like you, I was called a conspiracy theorist. And the liberals didn't admit to signing any of these agreements with the World Economic Forum. And that's just very, very, very concerning for many of you. It's concerning for me. So I undertook to submit order papers. If you can remember during the summer, and that was summer of 2022, I revealed that I believe that our government had signed an agreement with the World Economic Forum called the Known Traveler Digital ID program. Upon my return to Parliament in fall 2022, I received the response to the Known Traveler Digital ID order paper. And the response to the order paper revealed that the Liberal government had indeed signed an agreement for 105 million with the World Economic Forum, known as a Known Traveler Digital ID. And I've put up that order paper on the screen and just highlighted the $105 million contract there. I In the future, I will spend time on this, and I will come back to the Known Traveler Digital ID program and the order paper going through it. But that inquiry was from last summer, and there's a more pressing issue in dealing with the order paper that I received back from the Agile Nations Charter. And my goal is just to give you the information so that you can start to think about policy direction that this liberal government has decided to take our country in and the secrecy around signing the Agile Nations Charter with the World Economic Forum. Many of you don't know what Agile Nations is, and that in and of itself is a problem. Our government, the Liberal government, the government of Canada, through the Liberal Party, has signed a charter with the World Economic Forum. This charter was signed in November 2020. Imagine, while Canadians were suffering under the trauma of COVID, of COVID lockdowns, and so many people were concerned about the future, our government signed a charter with the World Economic Forum called the Agile Nations Charter. The irony is that the Agile Nations Charter was signed between our government and the World Economic Forum at the same time that Canadians were complaining about charter violations within our own country. Now, let me take you back to how I got wind of this Agile Nations Charter. It was really by accident. I was reading some articles on rulemaking in international law, and I came across the concept of Agile Nations. I noticed that this term was used recently in a lot of policies that were coming out of our government. And so I started researching more on what this Agile term concept was. And I wanted to see if our government actually implemented it in any form of policy. I knew from reading some of the documents that the Liberal government had agreements with the World Economic Forum, and I just wanted them to admit it and to stop in all of the secrecy because it's really, really leading to some consternation on the part of Canadians. Canadians are really becoming stressed over all of the secrecy that surrounds these contracts and negotiations and agreements. The fact that our government has signed a charter with the WEF is an indisputable fact, and you see it up on the screen. It's unfortunate that it took so long for this fact to actually be confirmed, and that the only reason why it's going to be believed now is that it is in writing in the form of an order paper response from government. So, family, where do we go from here? What I'm going to do today is I'm going to start just by reading the responses to the order paper on Agile Nations Charter to you. And I'm hoping that in reading the response and sharing the words with you directly from the page that the government sent to me in response to my questions, that the legacy media will finally do their job. They will finally start asking questions about what is happening to our country. I will also send out some notices to you summarizing the order paper in a video. This order paper was responded to by the Treasury Board of Canada on behalf of the Government of Canada. And the first section is Section A. And Section A has the first question that I asked. And let me just bring this here. Um, Section A asks, what was Canada's role in the initiation and development of the Agile Nations concept and this charter signed in November 2020? The response that I got from the government was as follows. Canada was among seven countries invited to the panel on Agile governance for post-pandemic world in November 2020. Convened jointly by the World Economic Forum, WEF, and Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. The panel would bring together ministers from Canada, Denmark, Italy, Japan, Singapore, and United Arab Emirates and the United Kingdom, as well as senior representatives from several private sector companies for discussion on agile regulation of emerging technologies. In preparatory meetings convened by the OECD and the WEF, representatives from different governments invited to the panel, including Canada, and industry introduced and discussed a number of proposals for joint action. The United Kingdom proposed Agile Nations as a forum for collaboration and information sharing on regulatory innovation. Canada expressed support for the proposal and provided input on early drafts of the charter to inform the final version that was signed in November 2020. Canada has supported the United Kingdom in its first term as the first chair of Agile Nations to establish coordination and governance mechanism. Canada continues to similarly support the United Arab Emirates as the current chair. End of Part A. Section A clearly states that Canada met with leaders of the World Economic Forum on a panel on agile covenants for a post-pandemic world. The question is, though, why does Canada have to partner with the WEF in order to create a governance for a post-pandemic world? We read that, and I read out to you that the meeting was convened jointly by the World Economic Forum and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. We also learned that Canada provided input into the Agile Nations Charter before they signed onto it in November 2020. Yet over the past 2 years, while Canadians ask questions about the World Economic Forum and Canada's involvement with the WEF, the government allowed Canadians to be called conspiracy theorists, all while secretly negotiating to sign the charter. And actually signed the charter with the WEF on November 2020. The media labeled and demonized any Canadian that had the insight to ask questions about our government's secretive arrangements with the WEF. Just imagine the level of trauma that Canadians endured during the 2020 lockdown. And then our government was negotiating a post pandemic governance structure with the World Economic Forum while many Canadians didn't enjoy the freedoms of their own Charter of Rights. The Liberal government knew that the government had meetings with the World Economic Forum in order to create the Charter. And that would create the agile structure for a post pandemic world. Yet they allowed Canadians to be called liars, conspiracy theorists, and to be mocked and ridiculed. Canadians just want to know why all the secrecy. No matter which party you belong to, this is not how governments are supposed to behave. This has nothing to do with partisan politics. This is all about ensuring that we have a functioning democracy. It is natural to ask the questions that concern how our government operates. And many of the questions that people have posed is why? Why would the World Economic Forum have to convene a panel to govern in a post pandemic world? And govern who? We have a democratic government structure. This is why Canadians are confused about what this Agile Nations Charter actually is. And why weren't these issues discussed in Parliament before Canada signed on to this Agile Nations Charter with the World Economic Forum? The second question that I asked of the order paper is found in section B. What were the policy imperatives and rationale to sign the charter? And just turning to the answer, the Agile Nations Charter is a recognition, this is the answer quote, the Agile Nations Charter is a recognition by member countries of the need for international collaboration to create a regulatory environment in which innovation can thrive. For Canada, it aligns with existing policy priorities under the government's regulatory modernization agenda, which includes promoting regulatory cooperation to facilitate innovation and reduce barriers to growth, and helping federal regulators respond to challenges associated with technological change in order to promote innovation and competitiveness in Canada. End of quote answer, end of answer B. So, in response to section B, I say this. Section B of the order paper clearly states that it is in quote unquote recognition by member states. First of all, how did Canada become a member state? And who recognized this as necessary? I don't even remember this issue being brought up in Parliament. Although we have, although this is like a radical change in the way that we conceive policy in this country, this was not addressed in Parliament. The Agile Nations Charter is meant to create a regulatory environment in which innovation can thrive. That's what answer B said. And the question is, what do they mean? Why by a regulatory environment? Why does this have to be done with the WEF and outside of our natural regulatory framework? The question is, Why do we need to collaborate at all with the WF in order to create a regulatory environment in which innovation can thrive? Why is the parliamentary system of creating enabling legislation and regulations that are attached to those laws, why is this not agile in a post-pandemic world? And why aren't we trying to improve our parliamentary system? Why did we have to sign this secretive charter in the middle of COVID pandemic? We also learned about the government's regulatory modernization agenda. Canadians need more information on what this regulatory modernization agenda is all about. How does this deviate from our normal regulatory parliamentary processes? If Canada is going to have a government regulatory modernization agenda, then we should talk about it. We should talk about it and debate it in Parliament. We certainly do not need the guidance of the World Economic Forum to set our regulatory agenda, even in the area of technology. If we're concluding that our government structure needs to be modernized, then the Liberal government should have respect for Canadians and our existing parliamentary system and have a rigorous debate in Parliament. In section C, I asked the following question. Which stakeholders did consultations on the proposed Agile Nations Charter take place with? And the answer I received is, quote, in addition to participating governments, the following organizations took part in discussions on a proposed Agile Nations Charter: Facebook, IBM, Siemens, Sherlock Bioscience, Suede Labs, Volvo, and Windcopper. So in response, at end of that was the end of the answer for C. And in response to the answer for C, we learned that there are a number of global organizations that took part in the Agile Nations discussion. So why are these corporations involved in post-pandemic governance? Is there a collaboration between democratic governance structure and technocracy? If so, shouldn't grassroots Canadians be included in this conversation? Why did the Liberal government feel the need to contact corporations about our post pandemic governance structure? But they didn't even have the decency to bring this matter to Parliament. The next section is section D, and this is a little bit lengthier section because it asks the question, how was each stakeholder in C, those are the list of corporations that I highlighted, how were they consulted and what feedback did they provide? Now, this is interesting. In response, this is the answer to D. The OECD and the WEF identified and invited the organizations listed above to take part in the panel on the agile governance and for post-pandemic world. In this capacity, representatives from these organizations took part in preparatory meetings for the panel at which the proposal for Agile Nations and the draft charter were discussed, along with a number of other possible collaboration initiatives. Stakeholders were broadly supportive of the proposed network and charter. Stakeholders provided general feedback, including support for the proposed priority areas, i.e., green technologies, transportation, data and communications, financial and professional services, and medical diagnosis and treatment, and for the need to share the network's work programs transparently so that all businesses could engage. Facebook, IBM, Sherlock Bioscience, Siemens, Suede Labs, and Volvo also took part in the panel, where they welcomed the charter for its forward-thinking approach to regulation. That's the end of the quote and the answer. I still do not understand why this was not something that the larger public was involved in. Siemens states that the proposed Agile Nations Network, which fosters cooperation and rulemaking, is a great step in the right direction. Why does the Agile Nations Charter need to foster rulemaking? Is the question, though. Is it the role of Parliament who to foster rulemaking? And who consented in Parliament to this global governance structure? The Agile Nations Charter is actually a radical policy shift away from how we currently create laws and rules that govern our society. Also, the Canadian public needs to be further consulted because they have deep seated concerns. And it's a shame that for months before the charter was signed in November 2020, that the Liberal government consulted with these companies and other countries and the World Economic Forum about the post-pandemic charter. And Canadians were not consulted on this specifically and have great concern about this. Next, we heard from IBM, the Vice President of Government and Regulatory Affairs, stated very clearly that the Agile Nations Charter is an important step in fostering the international cooperation necessary to deliver on promises of the fourth industrial revolution. Those were the words used. This charter is actually doing what they stated that they would do, and that's create a post-pandemic governance structure that's agile and doesn't have to be bogged down by the inconvenience of Parliament. It doesn't mean that there's a conspiracy. It just means that there is a common agreement on the direction that these policies are going, and it has been concretized and solidified in the form of a charter. Was signed November 2020. In a way, this charter, this Agile Nations Charter, circumvents parliaments because it's deciding on policies that often would have been before Parliament for debate. And even if this is what Canadians decided that they wanted, this concept, because it's such a profound deviation away from the way that we usually draft policy, it should have been brought to Parliament. This is not how we create policy in a Canadian democracy. It's it's almost as if these policymakers have given up on our democratic system. And that's just plain wrong. If this is the intention of the Liberal government to change the way that we govern, to change rulemaking in Canada, to be more agile, then they need to have the courage to have this conversation with Canadians. They need to take it to the people. So, the last section that I will deal with is section E. And in section E, I ask the question, what are the terms of Canada's participation in the Agile Nations Network, including participation length? On the answer that I got is, quote, as a member of Agile Nations, Canada commits to the values set out in the Charter and participates in the operation of the network. In practice, this means supporting the development of work programs, taking part in specific projects, as well as generally engaging with partner countries to identify common priorities and discuss common challenges. Participation length is not defined for any member of Agile Nations, and participation in specific projects as well as network in itself is on a voluntary basis. So what this means is that there's no specific end date for this agreement. You'll also be happy to know that participation in process specific projects is voluntary. In closing, I just want to say that we don't have to be stuck with this Agile Nations Charter. Our government has signed the charter and is a part of the Agile Nations group, which many of us has said sounds like a new global governance structure or a new policy charter. And if the Canadian public decides, if we decide as a Canadian family that we can set our own post pandemic governance structure, then that's what we should get to work at doing. Um, we could improve our parliamentary system if that's what we decide that we want to do. We must insist that this radical policy shift like what we've seen in the Agile Nations Charter, must be vigorously debated in Parliament. And so there is hope. Stay tuned for part two and part three of the video where I break down the different projects and the different departments that this Agile Nations Charter has seeped into. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you again.